Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mattia Riccardi. He is assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Porto. He does work in the areas of philosophy of mind, Nietzsche's philosophy, Kant's philosophy, 19th century German philosophy, phenomenology, philosophy of perception, and philosophy of action. So, Dr. Riccardi, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me to do the interview.
Okay, it's my pleasure. So, I mean, today we're going to focus on Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly his philosophical psychology, and also a little bit on his epistemology and contrasting it with Kant's epistemology a little bit. So, my first question would be in terms of how Nietzsche thought about human psychology, what were his insights in terms of free will? Did he say that we had free will or not, or that we had free will at least to some extent? How did it go exactly?
Okay, so that's a complicated question. So I start this way. So I think there is a certain notion of free will which Nietzsche does really reject, and I think basically everybody agrees on that. So Nietzsche usually, or let's say often, targets the notion that we could call ultimate free will. So the idea that I can really start, so to speak, as an agent, a new chain of events. So basically, this is the kind of notion of free will which is usually appealed to by people like libertarians and also hard determinists. So it's the incompatibilist notion of freedom, a kind of freedom or free will which is incompatible with determinism. And it seems to me that Nietzsche really rejects that. So the most famous passages in which he rejects free will seem to assume that this kind of notion is the one is talking about. So, for instance, in Beyond Good and Evil, he rejects free will as causa sui, so the capacity to cause oneself to be this kind of initial cause of a new set or a series of events. Of course, assuming that he really rejects that, the question remains, so what about a compatibilist notion of free will? So a notion which is compatible with determinism. First, one could ask, well, is really Nietzsche in some way committed to determinism? It's not easy to answer the question, but my impression is that he is. At least some of his major notions like amor fati, eternal recurrence, seem to in some way imply a commitment to the idea of determinism or fatalism, and also some texts seem to vindicate that idea, like Beyond Good and Evil 22 seem to suggest that his picture of the world is also committed to the idea that everything which happens necessarily. So he's skeptical, I think, against a certain way of understanding determinism, but not against determinism as such. So if we assume then that Nietzsche accepts determinism and that he rejects libertarian free will, the question remains, is or not a compatibilist? So does he believe that given determinism we can be in some sense free? And this is really the hard question. So some people like Brian Leiter says, no, he's really a hard determinist. Many other people like Ken James, John Richardson, a lot of our Nietzsche scholar in Portugal, João Constancio, for instance, in Lisbon, they all say in some way that he's a compatibilist, that he allows for some form of freedom. I think, put in this way, it's very hard to find a solution to this problem, because I think that when so something peculiar to Nietzsche's approach to the problem of free will is that he doesn't seem to think that it is a purely metaphysical or descriptive problem, but is something which is also normative. So I think Nietzsche seems to believe that what we think about freedom and free will depends basically from a certain evaluative perspective we have. And he surely thinks that in case of incompatibilist free will, it is the kind of evaluative perspective which he finds, let's say, in Christian morality. So, as he puts it, okay, I want to have some to be able to point at someone and say, okay, you're guilty of what you did, and this story requires me to think that you are a free agent to do that. But on the other way around, I think that his endorsement of fatalism is also motivated by his own normative viewpoint, which is quite contrary to that of Christian morality, and that's why he thinks, why I think that Nietzsche usually associate what he calls freedom, which is basically the capacity to set new values, to be the source of your own evaluative stance, with nobility. I say so. The noble person, which is not a social notion, is more like a psychological notion, is the one who is able to do that. But so we introduce then also a normative dimension, which changes which really changes the way in which we look at the entire debate about free will. It's no longer a purely descriptive or metaphysical question, but it becomes basically a more normative view. So I think Nietzsche wants to defend or propose a version of fatalism, but more than that is a certain kind of ideal person who reacts with a certain affective stance to fatalism. And I think that was it captures with the notion of amor fati. So the person who really loves the fate is not only a fatalist, he's someone who really has this kind of positive, affective attitude towards the truth of fatalism. So I think that's basically the most important point for him. So I don't know if this answer is...
Yeah, let's explore it a little bit more. So, in terms of his determinism, I mean, as you said, it's a little bit difficult to explore really what were his definitive ideas about free will and determinism. But since he had notions like the eternal return, I mean, sometimes it seems like if he believed in any sort of determinism, it would be a sort of cosmological determinism. But on the other hand, there are also several parts in his work where he basically laments that through Judaic Christian culture, for example, we moved beyond our more primitive animalistic nature and drives, and for example he makes an apology of the ancient Greek culture, which he thinks that was more aligned with our natural tendencies. And since he was in touch with the early stages of evolutionary biology as developed by Darwin and other people, I mean, do you think that when it comes to the human being and the aspects of determinism that are associated with our psychology, would you say that he would think that that derives more from the cosmos itself being as it is, or from our own animal nature? I mean, I don't know if I'm being clear in my question. It's a bit
okay. Well, I'm just trying maybe to restate the point by making another difference. So I think when okay, so we can talk about specifically the issue of determinism and the issue of free will, so to speak, independently of whether determinism is or not true. I start with determinism. I think that Nietzsche doesn't really say much about what his motivation should be for determinism or fatalism. It is clear, at least to me, that he rejects what we might call a nomological version of determinism. So the idea that we are determined because there are general causal laws and we are just subject to those laws. This is something that Nietzsche seems to reject. For instance, in Gay Sciences, he writes something that, there are no laws, there are only necessities. So this suggests that he believes that there are really necessities, that things are determined, but not because there are general causal laws. So maybe Nietzsche was, in some sense, something like a singularist about causation. So causal processes are not subsumable to general laws, but are, let's say, particular events. And so we could compare that to certain things that Hume says about causation, but it's really not clear what it means. He never provides a clear or a positive account of how causation should work. Some people say he denies causation whatsoever, which I think is wrong, but he does also sometimes seem to deny certain notion of causation. So it's really a messy thing. But so basically my impression is that he rejects nomological determinism. He nevertheless defends some version of determinism, maybe one based on a singularist conception of causality. But it's really something which I should need more to substantiate. So the other question is, given Nietzsche's idea that we should look at human beings like some kind of animals, okay, as he says, we should go back to the homo natura, okay, to the humans as purely natural beings. One could say maybe only doing that is enough to understand that we lack free will. And there, you can find, in fact, arguments in Nietzsche that could be developed this way. So, for instance, so people like Adinamius, who has worked a lot on free will and empirical challenges to free will in contemporary philosophy, says, well, if you really denies that conscious states, all right, are involved in our decision making or agency, you really are undermining the very notion of free will. And since Nietzsche, as I believe, does that, one could say, well, Nietzsche has an argument against free will, which is independent from any discussion about determinism. It's just our notion of free will presupposes that conscious states, like conscious intentions, causally contribute to our action. So if you remove that belief, the very notion of free will no longer works. So given that, I think that even if we want to say that Nietzsche preserves a certain notion of freedom, which I think it's not impossible to say, in fact, he still uses in some positive sense that notion, but it's surely the case that this notion is very, very different from the traditional notion of freedom or the traditional notion of free will, even the compatibilist one. So it's a very minimal and highly there is a technical term in philosophy for that, revisionary, so a highly revisionary concept of freedom, okay, which is very different from also from the compatibilist one.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the role that consciousness played in his philosophical psychology, I mean, at least when applied to introspection, did he believe that people through introspection really could have a powerful impact on their psychology and behavior or not?
Okay, so I think Well, introspection, I mean, if you look at introspection applied to the issue of agency or action, so I think the basic idea, or so what most people, let's say what most philosophers think that introspection does in that case is it provides very reliable, maybe immediate knowledge about what we are doing. Okay, it's a primary source we have about. It's the primary source of our knowledge about our own actions. Anscombe makes this point very powerfully. She says, okay, it's really, we have this kind of non-observational direct knowledge of what we do while we are acting. And I think so. This picture is, I would say, relatively shared. Okay, there are very versions of that, but the basic idea is shared among most philosophers, I would say. But Nietzsche really rejects the idea that conscious introspection is a source of knowledge about our own actions. And the why he does that is a bit complicated to understand. But the basic idea is that first, conscious introspection is not a matter of direct or immediate awareness of what we do or of our mental states or something like that. It is an interpretive and highly hermeneutic thing. So when we when we consciously introspect, we in fact apply some kind of folk psychological framework to make sense of ourselves and what we do. And Nietzsche believes that such psychological, folk psychological frameworks are highly falsifying and distorting. So we don't really know exactly how we work in psychological terms by doing that, but we get a very distorted picture of how we work at the psychological level in general, and specifically in the case of action, so as agents.
Yeah, but I mean, would there be any way for us through introspection to change our behavior according to Nietzsche? Or is it just that whenever we try to get some sort of insight about our own psychology, the best we can do is to distort it or to come up with some sort of post hoc rationalization or something like that?
Well, I think that's what usually happens, at least with introspection in the case of Nietzsche. I think he in general says that if you really want to get self-knowledge in general, you know, in the case of action, but also in general, the best route is not to rely on first-person introspection, but rather to third-personal ways of doing that. Like genealogy, for instance, is a method which is first-personal. It's just, you know, trying to understand where the values that we unreflectively assume, where do they come from? And so it's a way to get knowledge about ourselves, which is more reliable than an introspection. So that's an example. I think he also allows for some, say, first personal experiences to play a role in self-knowledge. I think a major example is illness. So Nietzsche usually talks a lot about his illness, in particular in the prefaces that he added in 1886 to a second edition to all his previous work. And he is in all those prefaces he talks about himself, about getting ill, and about convalescence and all those kind of things. And one point he seems to be making, at least to me, is that those experiences had a powerful epistemological impact on his life. So he could learn a lot of things about himself by getting ill. And I thought that may seem a strange idea, but you know, if you really want to study, let's say, as an empirical psychologist, or as a for instance, how the mind work, it's very important to study, you know, the pathological or dysfunctional cases, because there you really get a lot of information that you couldn't get, let's say, just by studying the normal. And I think for Nietzsche, his own illness was a bit like that. He could really come to see things about himself he never realized before. So I think that could be some kind of first personal experience which triggers a process of self-knowledge. But I think in general, so Nietzsche believes that the introspection is not very reliable. He also thinks, every action is in fact unique. So as long as we try to interpret them using certain concepts, certain mental concepts, we really lose all this kind of unicity. So of course, this kind of extreme particularism about action he defends is philosophically not easy to motivate, but well, it's just one assumption he makes about action. So that's also one reason why he believes that introspection isn't that reliable.
Mm-hmm. So another question, there's this concept in Nietzsche's philosophy about the drives. Could you explain that? What are drives for Nietzsche? And I mean, sometimes when I read about that in Nietzsche's books, it seems to me, at least some of the time, they appear like homunculi in our minds. I mean, like small, different personalities that operate in our minds. I mean, is that a correct perspective of Nietzsche's philosophy about drives or not?
Okay. So I start with the very notion of the drives, and when I go on to the problem of homuncularism. So the drives, so I think that Paul Katsafanis has done a very nice job in making sense of what drives are. So I'm going to say it's not the only one, but I think the most complete account of what drives are is to be found in his work. But so most Nietzsche scholars nowadays, I think, believe or share the belief that drives are some kind of behavioral dispositions. Okay, so they come very close to instincts. That's also why Nietzsche describes drives in terms of instincts on many occasions. So he uses the two words basically with the same meaning. But so basically, a drive is a behavioral disposition, and which, in particular, is supposed to trigger certain kinds of behavior, which then should satisfy the drive's goal. So, drives trigger what we may call purposive behavior to satisfy a certain goal. Which is the drive's goal then. And so it is a disposition to trigger behaviors oriented to the satisfaction of that goal. And also another thing that drive usually activate in the subject is a certain affective stance. So let's say affective states. An example would be that so suppose I have something like, a basic drive is like the hunger drive. And as I go along, the hunger drive makes me see, food items become more salient in my environment, and also triggers in me, so the food searching behavior, so to speak, and also positively balanced effects towards food items or something like that. So that would be what I drive is. So I think in contemporary work on emotions, Deanna and Teroni, they wrote an introduction to the emotion, and they talk about multi-track dispositions. I think that's basically what it drives are, according to Nietzsche. So it comes very close to this notion of multi-track behavioral disposition. So a drive can trigger different effects. So an example would be a drive to protect your own children. When you so it can trigger love, I don't know, on many occasion, but it can also trigger fear in many occasions. So if you see a car approaching to one of your children, the drive to protect your children in that case was respond activating fear, and so then it would trigger the appropriate behavior to try to to grab your kids and save them for the car. But in other occasions, the same drive would activate different effective responses. But the idea would always be all those effects and behavior would be adequate to satisfy the drive's goal. In that case, protect your own children. So that could be another example of a drive which was actually assumed to be one of the fundamental drive by also some of the psychologists and biologists Nietzsche read back then. So it's an example of a drive known to him, so to speak. Okay, the homuncularism. So what are homunculi first? Well, so the problem of homuncularism actually appears any time you breaks up the mind into different things, elements that could be called parts, subsystem, faculties, whatever. So if you do that to explain the behavior of the whole person, you get the problem of homuncularism, because it may look that these parts they work themselves as tiny person, which is basically what an homunculus actually is inside your head. Okay, and so there are one problem is that if you do that, you're not explaining anything. So you have to explain the behavior of the whole person, and you explain that by positing a tiny person in your head. So that doesn't really explain what you should explain. Or even worse, sometimes you ascribe to those parts or subsystems of the mind mental states which are things that only the whole person can have, like intentions, perception, consciousness, pains, or something like that. So I think I learned a lot on the different version of homuncularism by the work of Zoe Drazen. She wrote, I think, 2 or 3 papers on the distinction between personal and subpersonal mental state and explanation. And so I think I would really point to those works to clarify the general philosophical problem of homuncularism. So in the case of Nietzsche, it is true that he really describes many times drives as having perceptions, consciousness, things like that. So someone who pointed out the problem very clearly is Peter Pöllner in his book on Nietzsche and metaphysics in the 90s, and he says, well, this kind of mentalistic talk is really problematic. I mean, it commits Nietzsche to a very bad version of homuncularism. So how can one solve this problem? It's really a completely lost cause, so to speak. Well, so one thing that should be noted is that most of this very, very strong mentalistic description are to be found in his unpublished notes. So if one really rely a lot on that and things that there you can find basically Nietzsche's thought, then you are you will condemn Nietzsche to this kind of bad homuncularism. But if you look only at the published works, then things are a bit different. So I think it's not so easy to find so heavily mentalistic, intentionalistic talk. And so one way would try to, in some sense, interpret when he does that, this kind of mentalistic talk in a deflationary way. You know, Daniel Dennett argues it's no problem to, you know, postulate homunculi and even use mentalistic talk. You only have to be aware that it's just some kind of way of talking which in fact can be substituted by a non-mentalistic talk. So I think as long as you do that, there's no philosophical problem. And so one could try to do the same with Nietzsche. And so my proposal would be to offer a deflationary reading and try to understand then this drives, and in particular interaction is in a basically dispositional and causal way. And so to assume that, okay, it's mentalistic talk, at least when it appears in the published work, which is in itself not so bad as in the unpublished notes, could be seen as, so to speak, a purely way of talking, so to speak. Okay, but that doesn't really commit Nietzsche to ascribing, I don't know, consciousness or a rationality or a perception to the drives, so to speak.
I understand.
So I think that it's a strategy to salvage the notion from the problem of homuncularism.
Right. Let me just ask you a broader question about the Nietzschean mind before we move on to the last topic that will be about epistemology. I think that Nietzsche had a vision of the human mind that worked as an embodied mind, that is a mind that had a strict and intimate relationship with our body, with the way our body works, with our biology. And it's very interesting because nowadays there's an approach in the cognitive sciences that is known as the embodied cognition that is becoming more and more prominent. And so my question would basically be, is that correct, that the Nietzschean mind was an embodied one? And what were the kinds of ideas that Nietzsche had about that?
Okay. So I think there's surely a dimension which is basic in Nietzsche, okay, about the human mind, which is embodied in just that way. So in a text which makes that very clear is one of the speeches of Zarathustra, the one on the despisers of the body, and there is, it really says the soul is something, it's just a part or something basically bodily, and it distinguishes between, the great body, the great reason of the body, and the small reason, let's say, of the mind, which is, let's say, reason in its ordinary meaning. And he says, so most of our cognition is embodied, and this kind of bodily cognition is much more sophisticated, in fact, than what we usually identify as our own cognition, which is basically rationality or reason, which he calls the small reason. And so this great reason is in fact embodied, and it involves, let's say, what we might call cognitive function proper, like memory or things like that, but also or this basic psychological elements like the drives and the effects. Okay, Nietzsche famously says the soul is just the social structure or the social order among drives and effects, and that's what constitute a human being at its most basic level, and that's really something which is necessarily embodied. So the drives have, and effects are bodily realized disposition and mental states, and have and they have a very direct also link to behavior and to motor actions and so on. But I think for Nietzsche there's also a dimension of the human mind, which is basically what he calls the small reason, let's say reason, or self-conscious reflection, which is not really explainable only by appeal, let's say, so narrowly to our own individual body, because it is essentially social. So he says self-conscious reflection, or what he calls consciousness without any other qualification, is dependent on language, on social interaction, and so on. And so there is really this kind of social dimension, which is no longer narrowly depends, let's say, only on our body. So we are basically self-conscious beings, according to Nietzsche, because we share a language with our people, and because we live in community with other people. And So this dimension of the mind is so it's not unnatural, okay, but is surely something which goes beyond, let's say, the boundary of my individual body. So it involves our person, based on language, and language is social, and so on. So I think there Nietzsche, has some kind of externalistic insight. That's parts of mind, parts of what we could call mental content is essentially social and external in that sense. So I think he anticipates a bit, the insight developed in 20th century psychology and philosophy of language by people like Wittgenstein on the one hand, or Putnam and Burgess in more in the more standard, let's say, analytical philosophy of language. And you can also compare that to Hegel, actually, to get another 19th century philosophy. So Hegel also think that you can have only one self-conscious human being, so you always need. So self-consciousness appears when two human beings confront themselves. As this recognitional model of self-consciousness, which he develops in the phenomenology, and there is in Hegel surely this entire social dimension of the mind, what he called the spirit, the Geist. And I think Nietzsche, though he has a very different picture of the relevance of that, so for Nietzsche is superficial and not very useful in a certain way, but they both share this claim according to which part of the mind is in particular what has to do with self-consciousness and reason is essentially social, and so it goes beyond, let's say, the boundary of one's body, of one's individual.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. So let us just talk about one last topic that has to do with Nietzsche's epistemology and contrasting it with some aspects of Kant's epistemology. And let's talk specifically about Kant's notion of thing in itself and the distinction he made between the noumenon and the phenomenon. So, I know that Nietzsche went through several different phases during his literary life, but in the later phases, let's say, how would you say he thought about the distinction that Kant made between the noumenon and the phenomenon? Those kinds of things. Did he thought that the noumenon was a relevant thing, or that we should focus only on the phenomenon, or what exactly?
Okay, that's again a complicated question. So first, it's a basically metaphysical question about this Kant's notion of appearance and things in themselves. So Nietzsche, up to a certain point, starts criticizing this metaphysical distinction. Of course, he shares that, let's say, commitment to that distinction in his early work. So he follows Schopenhauer in that. But let's say, starting from human to human, he gets more and more critical towards that distinction. Okay, a problem here is that it's not at all clear what that distinction in Kant amounts to. And up to a certain point, the way in which we interpret that in Kant also has a bearing on whether Nietzsche's argument are not plausible. But so a first step in, let's say, Nietzsche's criticism of the distinction in Kant appears in human to human, and it amounts to a certain agnosticism. So Nietzsche argues, so even Kant recognizes that our entire life actually is confined to the phenomenal realm, So, the phenomenal realm is the realm of our experience. So, if there is a thing in itself beyond that, if So what kind of properties those things in themselves or that thing in itself have or has beyond our, let's say, world of experience? I mean, who cares? It doesn't make any difference at all. So that's basically the agnosticism we get from human whole to human. He says in one aphorism there at the end, the Kant's thing in himself, it's worth a Homeric laugher. So it doesn't really. It's a useless notion anyway, because we could never have an epistemic access to the world of the things in themselves or of the thing in itself. So one problem is that Nietzsche also takes up, let's say, the early Nietzsche takes up this version of the Kantian distinction, which is the Schopenhauer one, according to which there is only one big thing in itself, the metaphysical will, wherever Kant surely speaks of different things in the self, in the plural. So this plural notion, let's say, of the thing in itself seems to be something that Nietzsche focused on later in his career, and there he, which is good because it's really more like Kant's own notion. And there, I think Nietzsche sometimes seems to be presenting a much stronger point. It's not that we should be agnostic with respect to the notion of the thing in itself, but he says, okay, that notion doesn't really make sense at all. Okay, at least in Beyond Good and Evil, I think 16, if I remember correctly, he says thing in itself is just a self-contradictory notion. Unfortunately, he doesn't say why. So, and he never does that in his published works. So if you look at the Nachlass from that, so the unpublished things from that period, you find something pointing to a possible argument, which I don't think is a bad argument, but it needs some complication. Okay, so if you give me 5 minutes, I can try to. It's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The first thing is that so there we need to go back to Kant. Okay, I think so there are two basic ways to understand Kant's distinction between things in themselves and appearances: the so-called one world or one object view, or the two world and two objects view. The first one seemed, at least as I worked on that, seemed to me the best reading, and I still believe that. So there has been very important work by people like Ralph Walker and Nick Stang attacking, the most powerful one object or one word readings, those, for instance, by Lucy Hallez and Ray Langton. But I think that something like a one object view is the correct one, in particular the metaphysical one put forward by Ray Langton. So the idea is that the thing in, say, the appearances and things in themselves, they are not two distinct sets of objects, but they are basically the same objects. Appearances is the thing considered as only having relational properties, and the thing in itself is the same thing considered as only having intrinsic properties. So the distinction is a metaphysical, but so we have one thing but two distinct sets of properties, and we, as long as we can consider that thing as an appearance, we consider it only as having relational properties. And when we look at the same thing as it is in itself, an sich selbst betrachtet, as Kant says in German, often really considered in itself, then we have the thing considered only in its purely inner constitution, purely inner determination or intrinsic properties. Okay, I think that Nietzsche has an argument which is not so bad with if we assume that basically that's the Kant distinction. Okay, so sometimes Nietzsche writes things like that in his Nachlass. So everything we know only shows relational properties, and that's something that Kant would recognize. Okay, because it says really knowledge is confined to the realm of the empirical object, and empirical object only display relational properties. So at least they are things as experienced by us, or they always are spatio-temporal, and space and time is always something relational. So, or spatial properties are in some sense relational. Okay. So, so that's the first point. The second point is, so why then believe that the thing we experience, and we always experience only having relational properties, needs to have also this kind of intrinsic nature we will never be able to come to know. And Nietzsche thinks, well, we have, so Kant provides us with no reason to introduce that notion. Okay. And it seems to be a presupposition of Kant that we cannot simply have metaphysically something which is purely relational. And that's a presupposition that Nietzsche doesn't want to accept. He accepts, on the contrary, that there could be something which is purely relational. And that at least, you know, our experience and knowledge of the world, the only one we have, shows that in fact all things that we found there in that world are purely relational. So why then believe that there must be something beyond that, some intrinsic nature to which those of which those relational purposes are only a manifestation or something like that? And so I think that's the best kind of argument that Nietzsche seems to provide. So I say seems to provide because you need to pick up different notes and you know, reconstruct a bit to get the argument. Of course, the argument doesn't really show what he says in Beyond Good and Evil, that the notion of thinking itself is a self-contradiction. It shows rather that Kant doesn't provide us any reason to accept that notion, or to, it doesn't justify that notion, and so that we reject his presupposition against the very possibility of purely relational things or object. We really have no reason to introduce that, given that Kant himself recognized that the empirical world, the only world of which we have knowledge, we'll never find anything with this kind of purely intrinsic nature. So I think that's the best thing that one could get from the late Nietzsche against Kant's distinction between things in themselves and appearances. Well, Nietzsche says if you eliminate one of the two notion, it doesn't really make sense to use the other two. So if you stop talking about things in themselves, it doesn't make much sense to talk of, you know, the empirical world as just an appearance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So at the end of the day, Nietzsche never definitely denies that there could be a useful distinction between the noumenon and the phenomenon, or at least he doesn't say that the notion of noumenon is completely useless.
Well, I think he would say that. So he cannot really demonstrate that it is. So he claims that that notion is really doesn't make any sense at all. So I think he wants to exclude them from his philosophy. I think he doesn't really. So he's not able to show that the notion is self-contradictory in such a strong way. But I think so we can find some argument, reasonable argument against Kant's notion, like the one I tried to reconstruct before. Of course, Nietzsche also has some kind of, let's say, on non-theoretical, not purely theoretical reasons to reject the idea of, you know, a noumenal world. So, which is something that pops up, like, let's say, in Twilight of the Islands. They say, well, it's, you know, according to Nietzsche, Kant introduced the very notion of the thing in itself because he wanted to salvage, let's say, freedom and moral agency and so on. Because if, you know, Kant thought, you know, if all there is just the world as we experience them, that world is a world in which everything happens according to the laws of physics. So everything is determined, and as an empirical being, as a part of that empirical world, I am myself completely determined, so I am not free, and so morality is gone. And so Nietzsche, of course, reads Kant as being motivating to introduce the notion of a thinking self and this possibility of a noumenal world to leave room for morality. So this is very explicit. So Nietzsche also in 2 or 3 places he quotes the famous phrase in Kant's, I think it's the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says, well, I had to put a limit to knowledge to leave room for faith or belief or for Glaube, as he says. Yeah. And so, well, Nietzsche takes this really very seriously. That's his Kant very deep motivation. So the idea is, well, I just limit the extent to which my knowledge of the empirical world reaches to leave space for another realm in which the constraint, like determinism, I have in the empirical world no longer apply. So it's a kind of moral. Basically, it's a morally driven view, according to Nietzsche, the one that Kant gets at the end of the day. So the fact that he really reintroduces that realm of things in themselves and noumena is morally motivated. So that's why he really doesn't want to accept the notion of a noumena or a thing in themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we could say just on a final note that Nietzsche was a really complicated fellow and he wrote in aphorisms, so he wasn't really systematic, and I mean, it's really hard many times to really systematize what he wrote and try to understand his particular ideas. Dr. Riccardi, before we go, where on the internet can people find your work?
Well, I guess the best way is well, there is this field paper webpage. I think I think every philosopher knows that, and I think most of my papers in some version or other are uploaded there. So it's the easiest way to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to that and to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out if they're interested. So, Dr. Riccardi, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for this nice interview. Bye-bye.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, my 3 producers, Izar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Mikhail Ruzieski. Thank you for all.